This morning, we're going to be hearing from Zoë Rossman. She's a PhD student at the University of New Mexico. She is studying urban wildlife and is going to be teaching us so much about the species all around us and what we can be doing to coexist peacefully with them. She is a superb photographer, and I think her images are really going to blow your mind. We're going to share some contact information for Zoë. So if you're interested in her photographs or following her really exciting and cool research, you can do so. So look for that in the chat. If you have any questions for Zoë while she's talking, please feel free to enter those into the chat either on Zoom or on Facebook, and we will ask Zoë these questions at the end. So with that, Zoë, I'm going to pass it to you, and thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for taking the time out of your morning to be here. So like Emily said, my name is Zoë and I'm a PhD student at the University of New Mexico here in Albuquerque. And I'm studying urban wildlife ecology. I specifically look at medium-sized urban mammals like coyotes. And today I'm going to be talking to you about how to live well and coexist with urban wildlife. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of an overview of urban wildlife and why urban critters are so unique and interesting. And then we're going to talk about human-wildlife conflict and some of the steps that you can take as individuals to mitigate this. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about my research here in Albuquerque on our urban mammal community, which is probably pretty similar to the urban mammal community for those of you living in Tucson. And then, of course, we'll have time for all your questions at the end. So I wanted to start this out with a story. So this is a picture here of an open space in Albuquerque that's completely surrounded by the city. And it's a really popular spot because it's gorgeous. There's lots of trails. You have a really gorgeous view of the Sandia Mountains that rise over the city, especially in the evenings. You can look out if you turn the other way and see the whole city from here. You can see hot air balloons rising in the morning and the evening. And I go there because it's beautiful, but I mostly go there because this is one of my spots for urban coyotes. And so there's a family of coyotes that lives in this open space, and you can see them really regularly in the morning and evening, especially. But one evening, a couple months ago, I went out to try to get some photos, and there was an elementary school cross-country practice going on. And I wasn't really sure if the coyotes were going to be out and about because there were dozens of kids running all over the space and adults coaches yelling. And so I wasn't sure, there was a lot of noise and a lot of commotion. But I decided to go out anyways. So I was walking across the park and, kind of scanning the sagebrush and looking out for coyotes. And I noticed something weird, which was that there were adults all over the park doing the exact same thing as me. And that's kind of weird because normally I'm the one who's out there looking around for the coyotes and everybody else is just going around their business. So I finally stopped and asked, one of these people what was going on. And he told me, well, we're looking for the coyotes. And when they get too close to the trail, we chase them off so that they're not nearby while the kids are running. And so I asked, have you ever had any issues with the coyotes? And he said, oh, no, we've never had any problems. It's just to put the parents at ease and make sure the kids stay safe. And I think about this example all the time because it's just a really great story of the ways that people are choosing to coexist in their day-to-day lives with the wild animals around them. And this is a kind of bizarre and extreme example and one that surprised me a little bit. But in this park, the sentiments towards coyotes seem to be really largely positive. And I think a big part of that is that the humans who use this space are actively choosing to learn and live with these coyotes, one of which is here. But let's go back and talk about how we got here in the first place. So there's a really common perception that cities are the antithesis of nature. That cities were built for and by people, which is true, but that plants and animals really belong only if we bring them in and tend to them and want them to be here. So this perception that wildness is something that really does not belong in cities. And this is something that's taught to people inside and out of cities alike, but it's really far from the truth. So the answer is yes, like unequivocally, nature does exist within cities. And in fact, although urban ecosystems have their unique challenges and unique advantages, they function really similarly to how non-urban, like more natural ecosystems function. And although, we by definition play a really large part in these urban ecosystems, we have this whole cast of wild plants and animals that exist alongside us. So, for those of you in the city, you might know, like we have everything from tiny insects and birds and reptiles to mammals that can be as large as mountain lions coming in and taking advantage of city life. And there are plenty of animals and plants that live successfully and survive and even thrive in cities. But I'm a mammologist, so I'm going to be focusing mainly on the mammals that call the cities home for this talk. Now, it's really important to note that not all species are successful in urban environments. So, if you think of an animal like a wolf, for instance, some of you might be aware that throughout, our history in the last few hundred years, human pressure and urbanization have drastically reduced the wolf population. And because of the way that they are, because of their diet and their home range and their social structure, even if we could and would tolerate an animal like a wolf in a city, it's really unlikely that that type of animal would be able to make its way in an urban environment. However, there are animals, even animals that are closely related to the wolf, like coyotes, that do really well in urban environments. And we call these animals synanthropes. So a synanthrope is just a non-domesticated wild animal that lives near us and does well in our urban environments. And synanthropic species can be successful for a wide variety of reasons. Some of it's genetics, some of it is behavioral, and some of it, like temperament, can even vary at the individual level. For instance, species like a coyote, who have like a more general omnivorous diet where they can eat plants and animals, they're really likely to thrive in cities. A coyote can go out and catch rodents and insects and frogs, and can also eat, berries and fruit, and can also eat cat food and trash, right? So having that generalism is really, really valuable when you're in a dynamic place like a city. And in fact, I'm not sure if it's similar in Tucson right now, but here in Albuquerque, we're like nearing the end of like prickly pear fruit season. And so almost all the coyote scat that I see out is just chock full of prickly pear fruit. So they're really taking advantage of what's around them. And those animals are generally more successful than animals that are obligate carnivores or have to eat meat, or even animals that have just a really specialized diet. And behavioral responses are really important in understanding why some species are successful in urban environments and others are not. So animals might change their breeding patterns in cities. A lot of birds do this. All sorts of critters take advantage of human resources, which can be food, either directly, unfortunately, or indirectly, and shelter and water. And one of the things that I think is really cool is that some animals even adjust when they're active. So coyotes in remote areas are pretty diurnal. I can drive an hour south of Albuquerque and see coyotes throughout the middle of the day, like going around and hunting and interacting. But in large cities, they can be completely nocturnal. So my previous research was all in Chicago, and we would put like telemetry collars on the coyotes, and which would like emit a radio frequency, and we'd go out with a truck with these big antennas and track them throughout like downtown Chicago, and they wouldn't even start moving until 10 or 11 p.m. So well after it was dark and people had sort of started to go home. And there's actually a super cool study that looked at how fast coyotes returned to their like daytime habits once human pressures were lifted. And it's actually just a few years. It only takes a few years for coyotes to go from being almost completely nocturnal to back to being active during the day. So again, this type of flexibility is really helpful if you're an animal looking to use human spaces, but also kind of actively trying to avoid actual humans at the same time. And I think that's actually a really important point, because there are far more urban critters out there than you might ever suspect, but they generally don't really want anything to do with us. And so we might not see them all the time or know that they're there. And there's also a whole lot that we don't know about these synanthropic species and how and why they become successful in cities. And, urban ecology is a relatively new field, and there are more and more researchers setting up urban ecology studies around the world. But there are a ton of gaps in our understanding, which is fortunate for me. So mammals live in cities all around the globe. This is not unique to the United States. So there are coyotes in downtown Chicago who are living in abandoned lots or spending their whole entire life in a cemetery or like a single golf course. There were capybaras that moved into a gated community in residential Buenos Aires over the summer. You can see badgers in the London suburbs, and they've been reported like using railway corridors to get around. Baboons live in Cape Town, and they'll break into people's cars and houses looking for food. I have a friend who was in college just a couple hours south of Cape Town, actually, and she came back to her dorm one day, and the baboon had gotten in through her window and was sitting on her bed eating her snacks. So they're pretty ruthless. You have raccoon dogs in the green spaces in central Tokyo, and this is really just a few examples of the many, many mid to large size mammals that you can see living successfully alongside humans throughout the world. And also, urban mammals have been living alongside us for a really long time. There were urban coyotes in Aztec cities and in Chaco Canyon over 1,000 years ago. And even in today's large cities like Los Angeles, coyotes have been living in Los Angeles for over 100 years. So our relationship with these critters is by no means new. But as cities expand and we continue to modify our environment, urban animals have sort of come more to the forefront and have started making more headlines around the world. So what's here today in the Southwest? And I know that some of you are not from the Southwest, but many of you are, so that's what I'm going to focus on. You might look at a city like Albuquerque, which is pictured here, and see some skyscrapers. This is downtown Albuquerque, our very small downtown compared to a lot of cities. There's lots of roads and cars, some green spaces and planted trees. But between the lights and the busy streets and the pavement and the fact that there's people everywhere, it might seem like an environment that's unsuitable for animals. But in fact, we have a whole variety of critters that exist alongside us in urban environments in the Southwest. So in Albuquerque, all of the critters pictured here are seen at least occasionally throughout the city. Some live here year round, some come in occasionally, and some are just starting to become more common. So down by the river, we have the Rio Grande, which runs right through the city, right next to downtown, and there are beaver and porcupine populations living here. If you walk by the river, you can see that there's chicken wire surrounding like most of the cottonwoods to protect them from the beavers. And right now, when the cottonwoods are starting to lose their leaves, you can easily spot like a dozen porcupines on a short walk. I've kind of rebranded winter as porcupine season because I never liked winter when I was growing up, but now I look forward to it because I can see the porcupines. And that was what I did during like the first big lockdown. I just went out and counted porcupines because it was something I could do alone and outside, and they kept me company. We've got raccoons and skunks living throughout the city, and coyotes as well, plenty of coyotes who you can see in some of the busiest parts of the city. So we have coyotes on the golf courses near campus, in city parks. We have them by the river too. Someone caught a family of gray foxes on their Ring camera a couple miles from my house the other day. We also have prairie dogs that live in like the tiny wedges of dirt between I-40 and some of the highway off ramps. So like you'll be sitting at a light waiting to turn, and there's just like all these like a whole prairie dog colony with like the highway as the background. And then we do occasionally get bobcats and mountain lions and bears that come down from the mountains, probably in search of food. And lately, I know this is really common for those of you that live somewhere like Tucson, but we don't usually have javelina in Albuquerque. And this photo was not taken in Albuquerque, but I took it earlier this week and I thought it was too cute not to share. I've only actually ever seen javelina south of Albuquerque at Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge. But lately, literally just in like the last month and a half, there have been 3 or 4 different sightings of javelina in Albuquerque. So they're expanding their range north. And it seems likely that sightings here will become more common. And we're going to have to start to, to look at the role that they're playing in our urban mammal community as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the perceptions that we have of urban wildlife. And some of these are valid, some of them are, more misconceptions. But one of the main misconceptions about urban wildlife is that they don't belong here. And if you see an animal in the city, particularly during the daytime, it must be sick or lost or dangerous. But like we discussed before, urban mammals are really all around us. And just because they do a pretty good job at staying out of our way, it doesn't mean they're perfect at it. So just because you're seeing an urban coyote or a fox or a bobcat, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with it. And it doesn't mean that they're not, surviving and doing well in this environment. And one thing that's really interesting is that urban wildlife sightings globally seem to have increased during the COVID pandemic. And we're not really sure whether that's due to fewer people being out and about or folks spending more time at home and kind of paying attention to what's going on in their own neighborhoods during the day. But regardless, urban mammals have been making a lot of headlines lately, for better or for worse. There's also the perception that wild animals are disease-ridden, which is definitely valid to an extent. For instance, we hear stories about rabid animals all the time. And it's a serious concern, but fortunately, it's pretty rare. So animals like bats and skunks are the main rabies vectors. But the last time a coyote tested positive for rabies in New Mexico was in 2017. And there are plenty of other diseases that can be passed from wild animals to our pets or to us and vice versa. But there are some actions that we can take to prevent this. And I will get to that. There's another valid concern that animals, especially animals like coyotes and javelina, will eat or attack pets, especially small dogs and cats. And this is also a valid concern. An animal like a coyote, again, is pretty opportunistic with their diet. So unfortunately, an unsupervised pet might be an easy target. And finally, probably the major concern regarding wild mammals is attacks on humans. And this is a serious and not unfounded concern. Coyote attacks have been making headlines across the country recently. In fact, some of you might have seen a few weeks ago, there was a bunch of news about coyotes in Stanley Park, Vancouver. There were a series of attacks on humans, and they ended up euthanizing several of those coyotes in order to prevent this. And it's really important to note that this is not typical coyote behavior, and it's obviously not okay. But one thing that all of these concerns about wildlife have in common is that they can usually be addressed. And on the individual level, there are some things that you can do in your day-to-day life that ensure that you're keeping yourself and the animals around you safe. So some of the things that have made headlines lately for human-wildlife conflict in our urban environments. This was just last week. Arizona Game and Fish warned about pumpkins attracting wildlife. We stick out pumpkins on Halloween and think of that as a totally normal thing to do. But animals like javelina and coyote and other critters can be attracted to folks' fall displays and start to associate, these homes with resources and food. This was a kind of absurd headline from a few weeks ago about a Berkeley resident who tried to put a bounty out on a coyote that ate his cat. And obviously he got sort of shut down by the city for that, but there's definitely this sort of negative sentiment in certain areas. This is a headline from just a few days ago about urban bears in Alaska coming into Sitka after folks had been improperly storing trash in the city. And lastly, this is just from the last couple of days about local javelina attacks in Tucson. And although urban mammal attacks on humans are pretty rare, they do happen, and it's important to know what we can do as individuals to reduce the risk and be able to live well with these animals. So the absolute most important thing that you can do is also the easiest thing on the list. And this is just to not feed urban mammals. So you may have noticed that all the headlines on the previous slide were food related. And this is not a coincidence. The vast majority of attacks on humans by wild mammals are a result of those animals being fed by humans. And what happens when we feed an animal like a raccoon or a skunk or a coyote or a javelina, they learn to associate us with food and they become habituated and less afraid. So in fact, every recent coyote attack I've read about was a direct result of those coyotes being fed. And this is a really tough one, right? Because feeding is often really well-intentioned. Like nobody's going out and feeding coyotes because they hate coyotes. At least I hope they're not. But you know, there's this perceived unsuitability of cities for wildlife. So some folks think that if they see an urban mammal in a city, it must need help. Like it must not be able to survive on its own. But unfortunately, even with the best intentions, feeding urban mammals is never really a good idea. And for those of you who are like outdoorsy, who do a lot of hiking or camping, you might know the phrase, a fed bear is a dead bear. And that holds true in cities too. So feeding urban mammals has negative consequences often for us as well as the wildlife. And this goes for unintentional feeding too, right? So making sure that trash is secured and pets are fed indoors, so there's nothing left over outside. That's also important so that these animals don't start to associate you and your home with food. Now, alongside this, supervising pets and children can definitely be a bit of a hassle, but it is an extra step you can take to reduce risk. So, you know, making sure that your cats and dogs are supervised outdoors really reduces the chance that they'll be preyed on by a coyote or will get in a fight with a javelina or a raccoon or a skunk. And this largely goes back to most urban mammals having a pretty healthy fear of adult humans, at least, and wanting to avoid us. And also, you know, since I know many of you are from Tucson, in areas where javelinas are common, it's important to note that javelinas have really bad eyesight and they don't really differentiate coyotes from dogs. So if a javelina smells your dog, it thinks coyote. And if you're too close or it has babies, that's something that can lead to a javelina attacking a human. So even though, again, the vast majority of javelina attacks on humans are a result of those javelinas being fed, it's also important that, you know, if you're out walking your dog and you see a javelina, you just turn the other way. And that's the best thing you can do to make sure that you and your pets stay safe. Now, although urban mammals do by definition belong in cities, we still don't want to approach them or touch them, just like we wouldn't do that to an animal out in the wilderness. And this is especially true if an animal is behaving strangely or seems sick. And every city has local avenues for reporting sick or injured or dead animals, whether it's through the city or through Fish and Game or through established wildlife rehab centers. And wildlife rehab centers do fantastic work and give injured or orphaned mammals a much better chance at returning to the wild than us trying to do it on our own. So making sure that you're not getting near or touching urban mammals without proper training protects you and your pets and your kids and them from disease transmission. And that goes both ways. And finally, if there's an animal that's becoming too bold or that you don't want in your yard, hazing can be a really effective tool. And hazing basically just means scaring animals away. And it can be as simple as yelling at an animal that you see to chase it away, or banging a pot and pan, or flashing a light. And soon it will learn that your space is not a space where it's welcome, because it is entirely possible to appreciate the animals that we have in our cities, and at the same time, not want to worry about your kids or your dog in your yard and having animals coming in and interacting with them. There's lots of resources online about how to successfully haze different animals as well. But if you're taking these steps, even if some of them are a little bit annoying or a little bit time consuming, it's really unlikely that you're going to run into any substantial problems with urban wildlife. And if you're comfortable living alongside wild animals and you're not worried about your health or your safety or that of your kids and your pets, it can be pretty incredible to know that critters like these are just going about their lives in our neighborhoods and our cities. And there's lots of research going on all around the world on urban mammal ecology to try to better understand, what they're doing in our cities and how they're so successful. And that brings me to my research. So I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about what I'm working on, which is Albuquerque's urban mammal community. So despite the fact that Albuquerque has lots of research going on around the Rio Grande, there actually haven't been any studies looking at urban mammals throughout the city. And all my previous urban ecology research has taken place in Chicago, which was like a super exciting ecosystem to work in. But I'm really, really excited to be designing a project closer to home and figuring out what our local critters are getting up to. So Albuquerque is a really unique city, as are all cities, but we're an arid desert city. It's pretty dry here year round, although we do get the late summer monsoons, just depending on the year. We have a metro population of about 1 million people. But what's really cool is that we have protected areas on either side of the city. So on the east side of the city, we have the Cibola National Forest. And this includes the Sandia Mountain Range, which rises over the city to almost 11,000 feet. And they're beautiful mountains. They start out in the desert and go up through pinyon juniper and ponderosa pine. And then you have like beautiful mixed conifer forest at the top. And there's not a ton of access for humans, especially in the southern part of the range. So there aren't many people and there's not much development in this whole range. It's some really core habitat for animals. And on the west side, we have Petroglyph National Monument, which again is a protected area. It's more desert habitat, but it's still a really great space. And finally, we have the Rio Grande and the associated riparian area that runs right through the city. And this is really cool because there are certain animals that can be found here all the time, like porcupines and beavers, but there are others that might use it to travel. So you can see here with these yellow borders, even though the river runs right past downtown and parts are pretty heavily used, it provides this really cool north to south corridor for wildlife. So in theory, an animal could go all the way straight through the city of Albuquerque without ever having to venture out into, the suburban or downtown areas. So one of the first things I'm trying to address here in Albuquerque is what influences urban mammal occupancy here in the city. So although we anecdotally know about all the critters that have been spotted here, we don't really know where they occur or how frequently or why. So for instance, access to core habitat like the sandias might be really important for certain species. So an animal like a mountain lion might mainly live in the mountains, but may come down into the east side of the city occasionally looking for food or water. It's unlikely that a critter of this size in a city like Albuquerque could live here permanently, just because of our limited habitat and the high human use of green spaces here. And then we might have an animal like a porcupine who, like I mentioned before, is found all throughout this riparian area along the river, but might never really be spotted outside of the corridor because of lack of access to sufficient habitat. So people do see them crossing roads by the river. People see them in our biopark botanical garden, but it's not very likely that you would find one making its home in the middle of the city behind a Target. Whereas it's totally likely that you would find a coyote in the middle of the city behind a Target. An animal like a coyote can live in golf courses and cemeteries and smaller city parks. So you might expect an animal like a coyote to be more evenly distributed throughout the city. And we do see coyotes in the foothills and by the river, but we also see them in downtown next to the University of New Mexico campus. So proximity to things like the river or to the edges of the city are something that we're really interested in looking at, and especially in terms of how important that is for different species. But we're also interested in this whole other suite of variables that influence occurrence, such as access to green space or water, or urbanization levels and housing densities. So secondly, I'm really interested in if and how urban mammals are repurposing our built infrastructure for their own use. So there's a lot of research out there on how urban ecosystems influence the wildlife that lives in them, but a lot of it is from the lens of how does infrastructure negatively impact animal populations, through things like roadkill, light pollution, noise pollution. The use of existing infrastructure by urban mammals is much less studied. And understanding how these animals are using our current infrastructure can really help us learn more, not only about what animals are doing like right now and how they're using our cities today, but is really important to inform city planning and design if we want to make our future cities more wildlife friendly. And Albuquerque is just a super interesting place to investigate this because we've got this ubiquitous system of drainage infrastructure throughout this entire city. I know this map is a lot, but I'm going to explain it. So this is the Albuquerque Metropolitan Arroyo Flood Control Authority's drainage infrastructure map. And it doesn't matter that you can't read it. The important thing to know is that every single line on here represents some sort of drainage channel, every colored line on here. And so as you can see, these run throughout the whole city. And if you try to imagine yourself as a critter trying to get around, and you don't want to cross roads, and you don't want to go where there's a lot of people, and you're trying to get somewhere efficiently, you could hypothetically get anywhere you want to in the city using these channels. And the really cool thing about these channels is that not only do they run throughout the whole city, but they also run under major roads, which provides a safe wildlife crossing without the risk of being hit by cars. And, obviously, threat of becoming roadkill is a really common problem in urban areas, especially for larger mammals that have these larger home ranges and are trying to access more places. These channels also might be a corridor between different green spaces. Again, if you're a small critter like a prairie dog, that might not be so important. But for a larger animal like a coyote, you might need to piece together your habitat out of multiple spaces. And corridors like this can be super important in doing that. And some of these channels even have habitat alongside them. So you can see here, there's like shrubs and sagebrush and dirt along either side, which can provide habitat for some smaller mammals or animals. And that could in turn provide food for an animal like a coyote who's trying to get around. We have hard channels like these that are paved over with concrete, but we also have soft channels that are made of earth instead, and might be able to support more plants and smaller critters that larger mammals could forage or prey on again. And people have seen all sorts of critters in these channels. I heard a story the other day about somebody seeing a mountain lion using one of these a while back. But what's really important is our cities are growing and being redesigned to mitigate climate challenges. And we're painfully aware of that, especially here in the Southwest. And so understanding how animals are already using this infrastructure is really crucial if we want to incorporate wildlife inclusive design into growing and changing cities. And finally, I'm really interested in comparing urban mammals across arid or dry cities, and also along an aridity gradient to try to understand how urban mammal communities in cities like Albuquerque or Tucson might be different than cities that get more water. Because if you think about it, right, like desert cities are these oases. They may provide more food and more water and even potentially more habitat than the surrounding landscape. And this is exacerbated in times of drought, which we're seeing, right now. So it's really interesting to think about how that might differ from the urban mammal community in a city like Chicago or St. Louis that might not have that potential reliance on city resources compared to that surrounding landscape. So far, a lot of the research in desert cities has been done at the city scale, and there's been some really cool work. Like Phoenix has a long-term ecological research station there, where they've done decades of like really awesome urban ecology work. But what's been lacking so far is comparisons across cities. And so what's really cool is I'm actually working with a larger network now of urban ecologists in multiple cities that will allow me to compare data from here in Albuquerque across different cities in order to investigate this and look at how desert cities are different potentially for urban mammals and how urban mammal communities in cities like this might look. So we live in an urban world. Over 80% of Americans already live in cities. And as our country and the world continues to urbanize and we continue to modify habitats, understanding how and why certain critters do well in these habitats is really, really important in predicting what future urban animal communities are going to look like. And I think that's pretty cool. And just as important is understanding that we as individuals can directly and daily have an impact on urban wildlife, health, and behavior. And this is really key in living alongside them. Urban mammals have been here for a really long time, and they're not going anywhere. And learning how to keep us and our children and our pets and the wildlife around us safe is really the best thing we can do to reduce human wildlife conflict in cities and to promote coexistence. And, you know, once we've done that, again, it's pretty cool to look at the animals that are around us and using our spaces and making them their own. So thank you all so much again. I am absolutely happy to take any of your questions now. And I think Emily may have put these in the chat, but you can also keep up with my research or contact me after at the website listed here or on Twitter, Instagram at Zoë Ecology. So.
Thank you, Zoe. That was really awesome. And it's really helpful to understand what's behind, you know, the legends or the reports we hear about urban attacks on people. I think often, like you said, there's so many misconceptions or we don't know the whole story about what was going on. So thank you for sharing all of those tips.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that we've been thinking a lot in the Sky Island region about corridors for wildlife and what they need to be able to move around through an urban environment or between different habitats are things like the nighttime environment and light pollution. Right. I'm wondering if you could share any thoughts on how cities and their light environment might be impacting urban species or species migrating through.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's really interesting because I don't think there's been a lot of work done on light pollution with mammals. And it doesn't seem that urban mammals have sort of the same issues with light pollution as birds. For instance, like I know with migrating birds, it's a huge issue. And you in Tucson and here in Albuquerque and over into Texas, we're in that corridor, right? Like we get those big migrations of birds coming down and you might see like the PSAs about turning off your lights. And so I think it's really taxa dependent, but yeah, light pollution is a huge issue and it's altered behavior and has negatively impacted plenty of wildlife populations, whereas other ones just seem to deal with it. And again, it's all about sort of this holistic understanding of how different animals are responding to what we're currently doing in order to sort of predict what's going to happen in the future. And some of that might involve changing what we're doing to preserve different species. And some species might not care and might be fine, you know, living in a brightly lit city park for their whole lives.
Yeah, that's interesting. One thing that I've noticed, and I don't know what is behind it, but the coyotes, at least that come and approach or see my wildlife cameras around my house, seem much more concerned about the infrared glow from a wildlife camera. And I don't see other mammals caring or noticing or anything. Do you know, is there something about coyotes that make them more sensitive to that kind of light?
That's really interesting because I have heard that. I haven't looked into it. I am not sure if there's like a physiological reason. Coyotes are very intelligent. And so being cued into a camera being there at all might be something that they notice. But I have seen, like, it's so interesting you mentioned that, because I just saw a video the other day of a bunch of different critters coming past a trail cam, and then a coyote came and just jumped like feet back when they saw it. And I'll have to get back to you on that, because there may be something like physiological going on, but I would kind of suspect that it's just a behavioral thing and that they're pretty wary.
Right. Well, it seems smart to be wary. I just personally have seen them be really jumpy like that, or they'll see like their own reflection in the water and kind of jump, and they hear noises. They seem to be very aware of what's going on, which is interesting. You talked a little bit, and by the way, if anyone has questions for Zoe, please feel free to enter them into the chat here on Zoom or on Facebook, and I'll share those with her. But one of the other things that I've been wondering about, and we've been talking a little bit about it at Sky Island Alliance through our photofauna project, is to understand how the presence of our own domestic animals might be repelling or influencing which wildlife species are there. So I know you mentioned clearly that smaller pets could be a problem as a potential food source for animals like coyotes, but do you know much about how larger dogs or even livestock might be deterring species like coyote?
Absolutely. And it kind of depends on the species again, like an animal like a coyote probably isn't going to be deterred by livestock, probably is not going to be deterred by smaller pets, but might be deterred by a larger dog. But if you have smaller animals and smaller carnivores, like foxes or bobcats, again, it can be species specific, but it can also be relative. So if you have small animals, they might look like prey and they might be easy targets. But if you have large animals, those might repel certain species, and they might, stay away from you or your home. It also might be more likely that there would be conflict and fights, because not everything's related to predation, even though a lot of it is, because urban mammals need to eat. But for instance, I know, javelinas and coyotes, it's pretty common for them to get into fights with dogs if dogs are perceived as a threat, particularly if there's babies around. Our coyotes here, and this is kind of a little bit of a tangent, but our coyotes here, one of the concerns in this place where I spot a lot of coyotes is they follow people with dogs, and it really freaks some people out. And it's actually a really normal behavior. It's called escorting. And they do it especially during the season where they have pups or in areas where they have dens. And it's really just like making sure that you keep going on your way and get out of their area. And so, by understanding a little bit more about why they're doing the things that they do, we can sort of reframe, what some of the things that we're seeing that might be concerning, and know when you do need to be concerned. But that kind of got off the point of your question. It depends is the answer, as with so much of of ecology. So certain animals may be attracted to your home because of pets, and certain animals might definitely be repelled. And it's something that people are actively looking at as well in different cities.
Interesting. Well, I didn't realize that the term escorting, I know personally, I don't have a dog, but I walk down my dirt road outside of my house, and I feel if I actually turn around, sometimes I'll see a coyote behind me, and are they really just always crossing behind me? But now I think they're probably keeping watch, which them.
Absolutely.
We have a question from Kate. Do you have any tips for spotting coyotes?
Ooh, that's a good question. Being out at night a lot. I'm assuming you're talking about urban coyotes. A lot of times you don't see them during the day. Again, it depends on sort of the specific coyote. Bolder ones you might be more likely to see during the day. But really finding places where people have reliably seen them. I don't know if you're familiar with iNaturalist, but it's a app and a website that people can put in sightings. Emily and I were talking about this a little bit before the seminar. People aren't always the best at putting urban animals into iNaturalist. One thing that I've been found super effective is local Facebook groups, like local critters groups. We have a Critters of New Mexico group here where people will post urban wildlife. And occasionally, you know, if somebody's constantly posting coyotes, you can maybe send them a nice message and say, hey, you know, I'm somebody who's interested in wildlife. I would love to know, you know, where you're seeing these critters. I know a lot of people post things on Nextdoor, but animals like coyotes in urban areas tend to have, I shouldn't say that. It can vary. You can have animals that have really large home ranges and don't really have a core habitat, but lots of coyotes in urban areas do have a core habitat that they stay in. And so if you can figure out where the parks or golf courses or cemeteries that they're really spending time in, and then just kind of stake those out, either at night, or if you're not comfortable with that, like I don't like going out alone at night in the city. So I tend to go, you know, in the early morning and the evening, and I still see plenty.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's good. Those are good tips. Are people collaring coyotes to see really how big their home ranges are?
Yeah, they absolutely are. So some of the work I was doing previously in Chicago was with collared coyotes that we were tracking via telemetry, and results from previous studies there. They've had collared coyotes there for decades, doing some super cool work. And some coyotes are so variable. There's so much individual variation, which just makes them absolutely amazing and also kind of a pain to study. But some coyotes will literally spend their entire life in like a one city block cemetery, and will hunt there, will have their dens there and raise their pups there, and literally never venture outside of that one area. And you have other coyotes that they call like transient coyotes that can have home ranges that are like 100 square kilometers or more, that just sort of, you know, roam and don't necessarily have, you know, a mate or a place that they stay. And then you have everything in between. So you have animals in different cities that piece together their habitat via, you know, green patches. Like the times that I've seen coyotes at night just by chance driving around, sometimes they'll just be like walking down the middle of the road in like a pretty urban area of the city where there isn't necessarily a great piece of habitat right there. But they're still there, you know, out hunting and roaming around. So it's
That's so
super,
cool.
super variable.
Huh. That's fascinating. What do their dens look like, or is that really variable too?
It's really variable too. Normally they repurpose like other animals, like prairie dog and badger kind of dens in more natural environments. In cities, I know that they've tried to use like they'll, you know, for ones that den in big parks or something like that, it might be more natural looking. I know that coyotes have also tried to use parking structures as dens. They've tried to use like drainage infrastructure like culverts as dens. So again, it can be really variable and just sort of dependent on what's there. And obviously some of those are more successful than others. But yeah, it can be really variable. Coyotes are special.
Super special. We've got a few comments coming in. So when was that one of the viewers was actually escorted out of the Painted Hills Trail System by a coyote here in Tucson in June, and the coyote followed for half a mile.
Yeah, absolutely.
Impressive. Yeah.
It's completely impressive, and they're, you know, they want to be good parents just like humans want to be good parents. And
Mhm.
if you're in an area and they perceive you as a threat for whatever reason, or don't, and just want to make sure that you're not going to become one,
Mhm.
that's not uncommon.
That's
But
really
that's
great.
amazing. I mean, I'm weird. I'm like, oh my gosh, so exciting. You got followed by a coyote for a whole half mile. And I know that that's weird. But
But it's great to know that it doesn't necessarily mean the coyote's being aggressive. It's a combination of
no, not at all.
territoriality, just being curious and trying to make sure it's not a problem. So
Yeah.
that's really good to know. Someone else has shared the fact that rat poison is really an issue. And I know that's very common in the urban environment, and it's a huge threat to the food chain and for animals like coyotes.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about what the public needs to know about this issue and why rodenticides and rat poisons are so dangerous?
Yeah. So basically, with rodenticides and rat poisons, um, what's really important is that it's not just the animal that you're intending to poison, that you're poisoning. So you mentioned the food chain and those type of poisons. If you're a coyote that eats a bunch of rats and all those rats have accumulated rodenticides in them, that can potentially poison the coyote or the bobcat or whoever's eating those animals. And even if it doesn't kill the animal, it can like weaken their immune system or make them sick so that they're more susceptible to other diseases or threats.
Right.
So
So
basically,
coyotes.
just trying your best not to use poisons in the environment, because again, we have much more here in cities than people. So even if you think, oh, these are only gonna, poison the rats and they're not gonna get to anything, that will definitely make its way up to a coyote or up to a hawk or to a bobcat. So it's really important to do your best to reduce and, if at all possible, eliminate use of rodenticides for sure.
Right. I know that coyotes that exhibit mange might have that weakened immune system from rat poisons. Yeah,
Yeah,
rat
and
poisons are
things like mange specifically, coyotes can recover from mange. There are coyotes that get mange and then it goes away. And then there are coyotes that get mange and it slowly kills them, right? And so making sure that our coyotes are healthy and have a healthy immune system is really important.
Mhm. Yeah, great. So we just posted a link to some tips about how to avoid rat poison and other ways to manage rodents that are problematic around your house. I'm certainly experiencing problematic rodents at the moment.
Yeah.
So check that out as a resource, and it has a great visual explaining the impacts to the food chain. There is a question about coy wolves in the
Oh yeah.
Northeast. So there was a PBS documentary, I guess. And do you have any comments to share about coy wolves and what are they?
Yeah, so I haven't seen a PBS documentary. Coy wolves is really just colloquial for eastern coyotes. So eastern coyote populations tend to have some amount of wolf DNA in them. And that was, of course, back before wolves were sort of exterminated from the East Coast. They tend to be bigger. It's usually not a high percentage. I don't think it necessarily changes behavior too much, but eastern coyote and coy wolf are synonymous. Our western coyotes out here don't usually have any wolf DNA, but eastern coyotes do.
So you shared something on social media before that blew my mind about the difference in size of coyotes that we have here versus on the East Coast, for example.
Yeah, our coyotes are little. They're little out here. Yeah, coyotes out here are usually between like 15 and like 25 pounds. And sometimes they look bigger because they got those big fluffy coats, especially in winter. But eastern coyotes can be like twice the size almost of western coyotes.
That's
Yeah,
that's so
it's amazing. I mean, people really overestimate the size of coyotes, and I think that part of it has to do with us seeing like a wild animal and maybe like blowing that a little bit out of proportion. Part of it is the coats, and they can be pretty fluffy, but like a coyote is like can be like twice the size of my cat, like my little fluffy cat, and you think of them as being much bigger than that, but they're not that big.
that's amazing. Yeah, that really blew my mind to think of them
And
being
even
that
eastern
lightweight.
coyotes are like the size of like a medium dog, so they're
Right,
not huge.
right. So cool. Um, well, I have one last question for you, and it's really about just the range limits of coyote that we know it. I've read that they are expanding into South America, but what really is their broadest distribution?
Yeah, so they evolved probably here in the Southwest and northern Mexico, and their historic distribution is like the Southwest and the plains. And they have been dramatically expanding their range in the past few decades. So they're up north into like Canada and Alaska, pretty far north. A lot of that is probably facilitated by urbanization and deforestation and elimination of predators like wolves. Um, and south, they are almost at South America. So they crossed the Panama Canal in 2014. And now there's only, I'm trying to remember, it's the Darien forest system in southern Panama is the last barrier between coyotes getting to South America. And that's just happened recently. What's really interesting is that there's an animal called the crab-eating fox that is a South American native species and fills a pretty similar ecological niche to the coyotes here. Like they're generalists, omnivores, and they're actually expanding north. And so they have shared a small portion of their range with coyotes for a while now. There's a really cool study on it. I don't think any of their cameras have picked up coyotes and crab-eating foxes on the same cameras, but it's pretty likely that crab-eating foxes are going to make their way further north and coyotes will eventually make their way further south into South America. And it will be the first event, you know, in recorded history of carnivores that big, sort of moving between North and South America. So we really don't know what impacts that's going to have on native animal and plant communities and local ecology. And it's going to be really interesting. It's going to be really interesting to see.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's so much to follow up on. I hope we can have you back, in the coming
Anytime.
months or years to hear more about what's happened, where
Oh,
coyotes
of
have gone, and
course.
what you've learned about them in Albuquerque. So on behalf of everyone joining today, just thank you so much, Zoe, for sharing your knowledge and your experience with urban wildlife with us. I think we're all gonna look differently when we see at coyotes when we see them next. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.